This is Geek Gab with your host, Dornall and me, Daddy Warpig. We are back. Geek Gab for Saturday, June 4th, 2022. Happy Wrath of Khan Day.
Wrath of Khan Day.
Yeah. 40 years ago today, Wrath of Khan was released into theaters. So that's, 4 decades, 2 generations, old enough for the movie to have grown up and have grandkids, which I guess technically it has, because then after the original series and the movies, you had the next generation, and then now you have all the crap that's on Paramount Plus that I keep watching.
Well, to belabor
the
that,
third generation always goes bad.
To belabor that metaphor, yeah, Star Trek's getting a little long in the tooth, so all of its kids and grandkids end up being special needs children.
Ooh. And that's not even counting the original generation, which was the best. Things have just kept on going downhill since then. I don't want to take this.
I don't know. Season 3 of the original Trek is as bad as anything that you get now at points. I mean, Spock's brain would fit right in on streaming. Let's talk about
it. I have watched all this stuff on this streaming, and I can no.
No, I defer to your superior judgment. I have not watched more than 30 seconds of any of the stuff that's on streaming. So,
yeah.
Oh, speaking of bad streaming, I'm going to segue right into what's been going on my week. I think we're going to talk about this in depth maybe when it finishes, but I did catch the first half of Stranger Things 4. Much to my surprise, yes, they made a fourth one. And now I've got that Kate Bush song. I love the song, but Running Up That Hill now plays in my head every day of the week. So if you like to top your streaming with a little warmed over 80s nostalgia, you could watch some of that.
You guys want to know what I love about Stranger Things?
What's that?
I just want to talk about
grew up in that era. When the years it's set, I was right in between those ages in rural Indiana with a group of friends all playing D&D with siblings. I mean, it could have been made in my hometown based on the years I was growing up. So it's the first season I did an intensive review, episode by episode, editing everything. But with all that, with it looking like it could have been shot in my backyard growing up, I stopped after season
1. The Kate Bush song, I thought for sure I had never heard before. So I went to check it out after it was on the show. And it turns out I had it in my library and I'd listened to it occasionally and just didn't realize it. Wow. But after it appeared in the show, Kate Bush streams on like Pandora and iTunes and stuff went up 8,000%.
That's how it works.
Wow.
I just saw a news story on that today.
If you want to know how young I am, first time I heard it was a cover by a bunch of emo freaks called Placebo. And I thought, I kind of like this song. And then I found out that the original's so much better.
Was that on like the OC or something?
Oh, I'm not that young. Yeah, I just heard it on alternative radio.
Oh, okay. This week I've been spending getting ready for more reviews because I've been watching the first 2 episodes of Kenobi. Apparently the third one is when it goes to pieces, so I haven't seen that one yet.
Sure.
I watched the first 3 episodes of The Boys because they all came out on yesterday.
Black.
I was going to say on Friday, like that was some long time ago. No, I watched them all yesterday. I sat down for 3 hours, watched The Boys yesterday. Now I want to cry.
I'm sorry for you. The Boys did nothing for me. And I do want to say
No.
one quick thing about Stranger Things. Is it worth? No, it's not.
Yeah.
I
actually have a rule that after reading the first 3 issues of Preacher, I don't read anything or watch anything written by Garth Ennis.
The Boys TV show is completely different than the Garth Ennis comic. But they are becoming more Ennis-like the longer the series has gone on. So yeah, I would have to say that just based on the first few minutes of The Boys, I would not recommend people watch it in mixed company, or if you're living at home with your parents, because I know some of the people who watch this show are teenagers. Like if you're at home with your parents, don't watch this when they're around, or don't watch it at all. I should be saying, don't watch it at all. No, bad. If you're under 18, don't watch it.
also don't watch it because it's not good.
There you go.
That's it. Anybody listening to this show knows whether they lean on the Daddy Warpig side of things or the Dornell side of things. It is not Dornell viewing pleasure.
No. Yeah, it's gotten way nastier than last season, and I don't know why. They like tripled down on the nastiness, and I don't even want to describe the nastiest, even like elliptically describe nastiness. It's just really.
It's nihilistic and unfun.
No,
Guys,
I mean,
you just gave
yes,
me my
but-
next 2 rock album names. That's awesome.
It's just it. Go ahead,
Elliptical
please
description.
finish.
Elliptical description and nihilistic and unfun. I'm there. Sounds
It is
dreadful.
way more than nihilistic and unfun. I'm talking about not just goriness, but although there's plenty of that, yeah, go watch a nice, clean horror movie like Hellraiser.
Well, that's the thing
If
that
you wanna
I hated
turn
about.
down the goriness, Hellraiser will do it for you.
That's what I hated about The Boys. I checked in for 2 episodes and that was it, because Hellraiser at least pretends to be some kind of morality tale. It's like a traditional horror movie where the people getting killed are the sinners, and The Boys was just violence for gratuitous violence.
Correct.
It reminds me of a joke my brother and I had, like an inside joke, and now I'm sharing this inside joke with the world. Like, what if Superman punched a cow? Like, what would that look like? It even got to the point where there's like a scene where when we were young, we were watching an episode of Smallville, and of course they're on the Kent farm, and there's just a cow munching on grass right next to the fence where Clark and Pa Kent are talking, and my brother just look at each other and start laughing.
Well, now you know. If you watch The Boys, you know what it looks like when Superman punches a
This
cow.
is something interesting because we're talking about superheroes today. I've had a theory a long time that when you start looking at superheroes, especially the really powerful ones like Superman, over time you learn a great deal about the writer because of what they conceive of with these heroes, right? Because when you get right down to it, when you're writing Superman or one of those analogs, whether it's Apollo or Homelander or Sentry or any of the Superman analogs, the concept is, what do you think would happen if somebody had ultimate power and was not responsible to anyone else? And that ultimately boils down to, what would I do if I was answerable to nobody and could do whatever I wanted? So you have the original Superman writers who were, well, I'd fight crime and I would make sure that people were being treated justly and I would take care of, immoral mafia members. I'd fight super crime. Boom. The Silver Age, I'd explore the universe and I'd learn all these secrets and I'd still be a friend of mankind, etc. And then you start getting the 80s and 90s, and some of these writers come in and they're really just exposing themselves, their naked selves in a very real way. And you get down to people like Garth Ennis, who comic book after comic book after comic book, if I had no inhibitions and I could do whatever I wanted and I could get away with it, and then he writes it and I come to the conclusion, stay at least 100 meters from my kids, right? And what we're really seeing with the boys is these writers are literally just sort of letting their id go. If I had unlimited power, what would I do if I wasn't moral? And it's telling us a great deal about the writers, because the concept and origin of superheroes is very much tied up with the entire history of adventure literature, which starts in the 8th and 9th century, really, and becomes into a full novel form. And as early as the 13th century, 14 and 1500s, people were actively trading and buying books. Don Quixote did not appear out of a vacuum. There was a rich tradition of people buying novels and reading novels and talking about novels. And Don Quixote is actually based on the existing love of adventure books when it was written, which is, the 16th century, 14th, 15th century. And throughout all this, the most important element of adventure fiction has always been heroism. If you had more power, you should be more moral, was always the message. I mean, Spider-Man says it most directly in the modern era. With great power comes great responsibility. And throughout these ages, a century of fiction, heroes and superheroes have existed in one form or another. And with one or two exceptions until the very modern era, it was always, man, if you've got more power, you have more responsibility to do good and less excuses for being evil. And then, boom, the Iron Age came about, the dark age of comic books in the 80s. And now it's the whole, well, if you had unlimited power, you'd be this psychopathic freak and you'd be untrustworthy and you'd be a criminal and you'd kill people for fun. And it's an inversion of the entire concept of what an adventure fiction book is about and for. And I don't think it's very fun, and I frankly don't think it's very healthy.
Well said.
And then you have things like, is it Tom Taylor who wrote the recent Tom King, who's done so much to ruin Batman and ruin superheroes, because his characters who are superheroes aren't even powerful anymore. They're just losers. It's like, well, if I was a superhero, taking your, theory about them revealing themselves, I would be a completely self-hating loser whose wife or girlfriend browbeats him, and cuckolds him, and who hates himself and is miserable and is very effeminate and can't make a decision and just...
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you're reading the worst of romance novels. I was in the Army for a long time, and when you're out in the desert for weeks, you end up reading whatever's there. And the worst romance novels back in the day had the worst depictions of men. And now that depiction's gone mainstream in comic books in particular, and in a lot of the stuff that you see mainstream, where they're ditherers, they can't make decisions. They have no ability to deal with conflict, etc., which is more of a, it's a straw man, and it was a straw man trope for poor writers on the very edge of publication 30 years ago, and now it's kind of mainstream. And I would argue it's because a lot of contemporary writers simply aren't that skilled at understanding people. You go out there in the world, and the vast majority of people are good, decent, honorable people. You look at any sort of disaster area, right? And here's an example. Rod Serling loved the trope of, man, when there's an emergency, people turn on each other. The monsters come to Maple Street is probably his most prominent example. Oh yeah, everyone just turns on each other, and it's violent because people are inherently vicious and immoral. But in reality, when there's an emergency like 9/11 or the tsunamis in Asia or anything like that, what you actually see is the average person rushes around to help. They drop everything and they do their very best to help complete strangers. Prejudice flies out the window. Racism, all that stuff just vanishes. Hey, let's save these people. I'm not saying it doesn't come back, but what I'm saying is writers like to pretend that their biases reflect reality when their biases just reflect themselves. So in reality, monsters come to Maple Street. Oh, the power's going out. Things are going weird. People have bonded together and said, I wonder what's going on. Let's make sure everyone's okay. But Sterling wanted it to be the opposite. And then you see the same thing again and again. Mainstream authors mistake their own prejudices for how people in general act. And I think that that's become much more prevalent in the last 30 years, I'd say. And you're seeing a lot of bad sort of takes on human nature and mainstream entertainment. And it's most visible, I think, in superheroes because superheroes are written so big. It's so over the top and every bit of their portrayal, it's just easy to see.
Okay, so I'm going to take the freebie here and ask you about now we brought you in because you've been working on your own superhero ideas. So tell me what's your take on it.
Do you want to introduce our guest first?
You know what? I thought maybe you may have realized that there might be some people listening later who are like, who is this gentleman speaking with the dynamic duo? Welcome back to the show, Rick Stump, avid gamer, game designer, writer, and so on. Most, in my mind, of course, most famous or infamous for actually playing AD&D First Edition since as long as I've been alive.
This August is the 43rd anniversary of my First Edition campaign in continual play for 43 years.
Yeah. So the game's older than I am.
Yeah.
Rad. That's kind of an impressive feat, but also really cool, and it sort of says a lot about the game itself. But anyway, we're here to talk to you about you and your stuff. Welcome back to the show, Rick Stump.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. I appreciate it. I think this is my 4th time on your show. I believe so.
Yeah, if we count the side quest, the guide-in of game night.
Yes, absolutely. And it's always a pleasure to be here. I love coming. I appreciate you guys having me back. When I asked for it, you guys were very, very kind and brought me back. But yes, as I like to say, Champions is a new game to me. I'm sort of green at it. I only started playing in 1985, so I don't have nearly the experience with what I do with AD&D. But I've been working on it. I had the privilege of being introduced to. I purchased the Champions Rules, a condensed version of the Champions Rules, in '85, and then had the privilege to sit down with an experienced game master and play in '85 and '86 when I was in California with the Army. And then I've played continuously since then, various settings. I've also played Phase Rip and Heroes Unlimited and Villains Unlimited, Maze, Mutants and Masterminds. I mean, pretty much all Super World. But DC Heroes, I always tend to come back to Champions. I think that it's a very flexible system. And it's hard to believe it, but almost 12 years ago, I started a new campaign that was 9 years ago named the Atlantaverse. And it started off with my oldest of my 5 sons and their friends, and quickly grew, and it's been growing ever since. We now have, we have one group in Atlanta, one in San Francisco, Seattle, Toronto, Japan, Deep Space, and in the past, Pulp Heroes, where it's set in the 1930s. So we've got 6 superhero groups, and we have 2 supervillain groups. So we have a total of 8 active parties going on at once. It's been going on for a little over a dozen years, and it turned into a thing pretty rapidly. And we've been keeping close notes. And not too long ago, I reached out to Hero Games I've been a big fan of theirs for years, and they were kind enough to license the Atlantaverse as a setting. So I took about a year, a little more than, got all my notes together, got a bunch of sample adventures, hooks, villains and heroes, put it together so a nice basis, and it's been out for a couple of months now. It's doing very well. It's getting well reviewed, but more importantly, it was a lot of fun to make. I had Artenon Studios was kind enough to do the cover and interior art, and I'm quite pleased with that. It's just amazing and shows the unique setting of Atlanta off very well. If you're not from Atlanta and you look at the cover, you're going to say, where is that? If you're from Atlanta, you're going to say, oh, wow, the King and Queen building. That's cool. So, yeah, I've been doing
awesome.
superheroes for a long time. Yeah.
I'm sharing this. I'm sharing the screen right now. Everybody watching on YouTube can check this out. The cover's really cool. I'm glad you mentioned Artenon. I might have guessed. It looks like his style here.
I'd say that dynamic style that shows action, the crisp. I mean, it's got to be Artenon. And they got those clean lines. It's the best of the good old school comic books there. But yeah, the background, that's the King and Queen building. Local icons here in Atlanta, the tallest skyscrapers that are not inside a metropolitan area, the tallest suburban skyscrapers. So they're a big deal around here. But you can see on the right, you've got one of the main heroes, Silver Eagle. On the left, one of the main supervillains, Oberst Sturm. On top, you have Phoenix, the super mage, another hero, and then at the bottom, flying up, you have a major NPC, Amazing Man, and another PC hero, Sirius the Superdog.
Sirius the Superdog, love it.
Well, my oldest son, there's a running gag. They keep trying to make, the concept is they keep trying to make heroes that will break the setting or break me as a game master. So he came in with this idea of a dog with energy powers who can fly and has force field and can shoot beams of light and is as smart as a human, but is still a dog, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, okay, let's go. And it's just been an iconic character in the setting ever since. It's Sirius the Superdog.
That's great. Your kids are my kind of players.
Well, they've actually really tried. The cosmic level guys are their best. They literally sat down and said, we're going to spend a month and make characters where their backstory is so weird you can't fit it into the setting. And instead, it's what inspired me to go out and have the setting license, because it added so much fun to the setting.
Oh, cool. You're answering all my questions before we even get to them.
Awesome.
So just to repeat what you're saying, or put in my own words, so you did what I imagine a lot of game masters' dreams are. You had, not only did you have a long running game, but then you were able to write it up and license it so that other people could play in it.
Absolutely. It's, I've got this philosophy, and it was one of those things of, until somebody asked me, and it's been about 8 years now, somebody asked me, what's your philosophy on running games? Because you run so many. I've DM'd at something like 40 different game systems, more than 5 or 6 sessions. And I've got a handful that I come back to and run long term. I mean, right now I've got a 43-year-old AD&D first edition game. I've got a 16-year-old second edition game. I've got a dozen-year-old Champions game, and on and on and on. And they said, well, they forced me to think about it. And I eventually settled on what I call the psychotronic concepts. And you can see, we call this Adventuring in the Psychotronic Universe is the subtitle for the Atlantaverse. Atlantaverse, playing in the Psychotronic Universe. And the psychotronic concepts that I use are, 1, strict timekeeping for all gaming events. 2, verisimilitude. The world has to make sense internally, right? 3, status quo is always the enemy. Change has to go on and on and on. 4, everybody has to have multiple characters, because if you don't have multiple characters, strict timekeeping is going to ruin you. 5, characters can win or lose based on their own actions and choices. Superheroes can lose. AD&D characters can get dead, on and on. 6, players drive the action. I have an open world, and the players decide what they're doing. And last but not least, genre is descriptive, not proscriptive. If it's in the Wild West and you come up with a reason why they could find an energy weapon. We'll see if it makes sense, and if it does, in verisimilitude, it happens. And those ideas all together, I believe, are at the core of why I have a fair number of campaigns that last a long time.
And we're gonna use that. I hope you don't mind. We're gonna learn as much as we can from you because, as game designers and players and game masters ourselves, like that's a pretty cool feat.
Well, I appreciate that. My running gag here at home is I've been playing cribbage for 45 years. Nobody's ever asked me about my cribbage game, but I understand there's a difference. But I think that the other side of that coin is not only do those 7 things make it, in my opinion, easy to run a long campaign, it makes it easy to document it and for other people to emulate it.
We did a whole episode on that.
Say that again, Danny?
We did a whole episode on...
We did. And it was very good, and I really enjoyed it. But it also makes it easier for you to capture what your setting is like and share it with others. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. I know a lot of really good settings that I've been in, and it's almost impossible to capture and share. And I think that in particular, verisimilitude makes it much easier to share your creations with other people because they can sense and understand the internal logic of the world. And that's exportable. So the Atlantaverse, I think, was one of my more conscious efforts to make something that was shareable. And it's been a lot of fun. I've had a lot of really good feedback from people, some of the early people with the books. And not too long ago, I was talking with Alexander McCrease, the creator of Ascendant and Adventure Conquer King. And, one of the great things about a good setting is it can be system agnostic. You can potentially use Greyhawk with Rollmaster or with Palladium, or you can easily use the Atlantaverse with any other superhero game. It's relatively simple to switch over. But that's because that internal consistency and logic, in my opinion.
You're saying as long as you have sort of a method or a toolkit for conversion, like or at least a mental model of, okay, well, in Champions, a guy who has like their energy beam that's X dice is going to be modeled as a second level magic spell or something like that.
Exactly right. That'd be relatively easy to do. As a matter of fact, one thing that Alex and I talked about when I was talking with McCrease is Ascendant uses logarithmic math in the background. And oddly enough, a lot of champions, I should say, uses logarithmic math in the background. And so does DC Heroes. So it's surprisingly easy to convert characters between DC Heroes to champions to Ascendant in any direction. And once you get an idea of, well, Superman's roughly this many points in champions or this many points in Ascendant, it's relatively easy to say, okay, what would Thor look like, even though he may be in Phase Rip and not DC Heroes or Champions? So it's, with a little bit of experience in various systems, it's pretty easy. It's just like you could take the official setting for Palladium fantasy role-playing game with the Old Kingdom and et cetera, and translate it into D&D really smoothly if you just know both systems. You just have to translate men-at-arms into fighters, simple stuff like that.
Before we move on, we got some questions for the chat, and we're going to get to those in a second. Sure. Before we move on, I want to point out here in the browser window, so you said that's on sale right now. You can get it in a number of places. You can get it at herogames.com. So, and we'll repeat that again at the end of the show. For anybody listening away from YouTube, just go to herogames.com. You can find Atlantaverse, or you could just web search for it.
Right.
You got a PDF, and if I'm not mistaken, depending on where you order it from, you can order a hardcover, at least from Barnes & Noble.
You get it from Barnes & Noble, you get it from Lulu, and I do believe that if the hardcover is not available from Amazon now, it will be in a month. And I mentioned this offline. Hero Games has been amazing. Very approachable, very flexible. They've been very kind. Ton of help. When I got everything done, they did an edit for me, and they've actually gave some of the best editing feedback I've gotten from any source ever. It was just incredibly helpful. And then they got everything up for sale there, Barnes and all these places in a day. Just amazing. And they've also approved, I have 5 more books coming that are licensed, where I'm adding 5 more things from the Atlantaverse through Hero Games for the next couple of years.
Love it.
Very excited.
It sounds like an amazing partner.
I've worked with a lot of people over the years, and I'd have to say, of the game companies I've worked with, Hero Games has been the best, bar none. Just wonderful to work with.
And I had no idea. I'm not a Hero Games player, not a Champions player, but yeah, that's unheard of.
Yeah. I mean,
to get that kind of support.
I got a question, get an answer in an hour from a senior partner. You know, hey, here's the stuff. 3 days. Here's our editing feedback, crisp editing feedback, amazing stuff. Just a joy to work with. I can't say enough good things about Hero Games, literally.
Oh, that's amazing. Especially with the bad rep other game systems have. The only other game company that comes close that I've heard from is Steve Jackson Games. That's because Steve Jackson personally still is Steve Jackson Games.
Steve Jackson is a legend, and he's going to stay that way for a long, long time. I've heard that. And I've heard Autark with ACKS, McCree's. I've heard they're very good too. And I'm hoping, this is a little early, I'm hoping that Alex will allow me to, and this is not even asked, let alone confirmed, I'm hoping to make a version of Atlantaverse that is compatible with Ascendant.
Of course.
Yeah. So.
You two would be like peanut butter and chocolate. I've read his book Arbiter of Worlds, which I do recommend. Yeah, and you guys definitely have the same philosophy for gaming.
Yeah, it was a joy to talk to him the other day. It was me and he and my oldest son had a 3-way conversation. It was a pure joy. Yeah.
Cool. So let's talk about the chat. Chat has a couple of really good questions.
Sure.
Going back to the games that you've run forever. Let's go all the way back. Matthew Martin asks, what kinds of games do first edition AD&D, second edition AD&D, and Fantasy Hero lend themselves to? And I'm going to insert respectively.
That's a really good question. Based upon my 2 longest games, I find that for me, and this may be my personality and my style of running things, first edition is really, really good at a sort of lower end fantasy game where you're focused on long-term play. It's best if you've got people that expect to be playing for years, that you want a slow growth. You start off with low magic and low power and slowly build up to the domain level. And then once you get to the domain level, you just keep going and going and going. Second edition seems to be much more of a mid-level fantasy where you've progressed faster, you get to domain level faster, and you stay with domain play less long, right? And then based on Fantasy Hero, which one of my sons, Nick, right now is running a Fantasy Hero campaign. That really seems to be more of a high fantasy. You know, everyone has a unicorn. You can teleport between planets. Atlantean hyper magic. That seems to be really good at the high fantasy, giant concept, world-spanning games that are a ton of fun, where everybody's basically a superhero, but it's a fantasy setting. Again, that's my personal take, and it means it can be really difficult. Like the Monty Hall syndrome, where people want to get to high-level domain play, is really, really a problem in first edition. I find that a lot of people want to skip the 5 to 6 years it takes you to get to domain play and just start right away. And I think they'd be better served by second edition or Fantasy Hero that. Whereas Fantasy Hero, I've seen, has a tendency to really get over the top really fast. But a good game master can keep it on board for a long time. So that's my personal opinion on those 3.
Oh, that's interesting. I think recently we've been experiencing a lot of first edition AD&D. Daddy Warpig's been playing, and just sort of like that rings true to our experiences.
Well, I can see Jeffrey Johnson, who's an old friend of mine, Daddy Warpig. A lot of guys are saying, "Hey, play first edition, play AD&D first edition, as close to rules as written," and it really is just warms my heart. It's my favorite game of all time. I've been encouraging people. I've been saying for 20 years, if you play AD&D first edition, as close to raw as you can. You're going to really learn a lot about game design. And I've seen some great stuff come out of that. But I think, like you said, you're seeing some of that. There are, in my opinion, there are 3 emotional realizations that every game master makes. And I don't care what system it is. And this isn't about mechanics, it's emotional. And this is in no particular order. 1, some of the things that you think are going to challenge and frighten the players never will.
Mm-hmm.
2, some of the things that you think your players are going to find boring and easy are going to confound them and frighten them. Right?
Yeah.
3, getting to a mature campaign always takes longer than you want. And how you deal with those and grow as a game master is really important to what system is best for you. If you understand that, I'm going to have this. My personal favorite is there was a very, very popular vampire-based module for Dungeons and Dragons. Something Loft. I'm not going to go into the details. And for years, it was touted as terrifying and intimidating, and the vampires were really scary. And I do a thing once a year where I run a classic module for my family. And when I did it, I really played up the gothic elements. My kids thought it was a bad, laughable MST3K moment, right? They thought everything was laughable. They thought it was ridiculous. They thought it was over the top. They thought it was melodramatic. They speed ran the thing and went through the entire module, including killing the vampire in 5 hours. Laughing the whole way. Oh, things are bad. Oh, I'm really melodramatic. Oh, and it was, they just didn't buy it. But at the same time, I did another module, and they spent 4 hours terrified of a fire giant at the end of the hall. And then found out it was an illusion after literally 4 hours of dithering and how do we do this, et cetera, et cetera. So figuring out what your players are going to be intimidated by and what they're not going to be intimidated by is really tough. But the last one is getting to a mature campaign always takes longer than you want. How you deal with that is really determines what system's best for you, in my opinion. So my 2 cents.
Interesting. Interesting take on it. I think what's fascinating me is that the Pro-SR guys like Jeffro, they have taken those shortcuts to set up a game, and in the sense of an experiment, like an academic experiment.
Well, yeah, I know that Jeffro was doing a lot of research, and I think that the reason, now this is my opinion, I haven't asked about this directly. I think that he saw off Patreon simply because he's doing research, and he wanted to see what the domain game looked like. And if you're going to do that by the book, you've got 3 to 7 years, and if you're doing research, you don't have time for that. So slap some guys in there. Put them up in a domain right away. See how that works. Yeah, that's perfectly legit. If you're doing research, you want to see how it goes and find out how it works and what's the strengths and what the weaknesses are. It's not how it is in the books, and that's okay. And of course, faction play is old, and people love faction play. So I'm sure that it's really enjoyable, and I'm sure they've learned a lot. But yeah, I wouldn't call what the Pro-SR is doing Monty Hall. I'd say what they're doing is trying to research on how AD&D First Edition works best, and I think there is a difference there. But yeah, if you want to play AD&D First Edition as close to by the book as you can, it's going to be 3 to 7 years before you have somebody hit domain level. But I'm telling you right now, it's worth it.
That sounds fantastic. I have a worry about, where do we find new players? And I know we're going down a rabbit hole here. Where do you find new players if you don't have an established game group? How do you start on AD&D?
I wish I'd had my oldest son here for this. He has done this twice. Once at our friendly neighborhood game store. Went in with just the First Edition books during one of the, what is it? I can't remember. It's like Adventures League events for 5th edition.
Oh, yeah.
And he just told the shop, hey, I'm going to be in here in the corner. and I'm looking for people for first edition. And he very quickly had a group of 6 people. And
Wow.
and they lasted until he got a new job and the schedule changed. So a fair amount of time, like 18 months. And then at another time, he simply put out amongst his circle of friends, all in their mid-20s, hey, I'm going to start AD&D first edition. And it was almost exclusively never played before. Like, oh, I'd love to play. So I remember being in my 20s, I never had a problem getting new players. The tough part was when I was in my mid-30s with a couple of little kids. And
Yeah.
based on what Jack and Sam, 2 of my boys are out and grown and living their lives, are saying it's still pretty easy to recruit amongst 20-year-olds. So that's good to hear.
That's pretty good. I'm gonna have to go find some 20-year-olds then.
Listen,
That was a personal question for me because it's tough. Yeah, it's tough to find players, and especially if you, I think, and I love talking about the whole domain game and faction play and everything like that. You can simulate faction play with something like B2 Keep on the Borderlands, but if you and I hear what you're saying about taking the time to get a naturally mature game, but if you're thinking of a domain game in AD&D, you have to have a basic sketch of your game worked out, and a lot of people become obsessed with so-called world building.
Well, you're skipping ahead what I was going to say. You're absolutely correct. I've actually got a graphic. I should have sent it to you. It's my current map of Seaward versus the Seaward map I started with. When I started building Seaward, which is my 43-year-old campaign, I had a town on a river on a coast. Across the river was the Tower of the Good Wizard, where you could learn spells. And then 20 miles away was the pirates. That was it. This map was 25 miles north to south, 15 miles east to west, and 5 miles east-west was ocean. Nothing. From that, it has grown to be the main map is about 180 miles east-west, 90 miles north-south. The Kingdom of Seaward now has 4 major cities. It's got 5 big neighbors, etc. But when you look at it, all that growth was player-driven. The city of Eastport, which is a major rival, that was a player who domained and was mad at the NPC king. So he says, oh, yeah, I'm going to make my own kingdom with blackjack and hookers, right? And then you've got Timberlake, which is a guy who domained. You've got Adrian, a wizard that domained. You've got Cull, a wizard that domained. You've got the 4 counties, various demi-humans that domained. On and on and on. You got Wyvern Keep, a guy that domained. And for all that, for every guy that has a domain that's still in the map as an NPC, you had 2 that tried to domain and failed for some reason or other. So I'd say 80% of the huge growth of my campaign was player-driven. And it was as the players got higher level, I'm like, where am I going to go build my domain and doing it, everything else? So the organic growth, my foundation when I started it was my 12th birthday, the weekend after my 12th birthday is when I started this. When I started, it was, here's a town with a king and a wizard and some pirates. That's what I started with. I didn't need a ton of world building. It was the initial interaction with the players of what's over here, what's over there, that led to this organic world building that is now this kingdom the size of, I want to say, I think it's the size of Israel or something crazy like that, with a population of almost 1 million people. And 90% of that was the players doing it as they went up in level from first and kept growing and establishing domains and failing to establish domains. And to be honest with you, I'd like to think the Blackstone system that I set up my second campaign, I developed the entire world and all the governments, all the economics and stuff. I was in my 40s when I did that. I think I was 40 years old, 39, 40 years old when I did that. And I already had a lot of experience. I could have done that as well when I started. And a lot of what I learned watching 20 or 30 players get to domain level is what really taught me how to do world building. So there you have it.
Well, and I want to point out that if anybody's not familiar with AD&D and you're still listening to this, I don't know why. I don't know how you could be here and not know, but AD&D has lots of procedural systems for doing that expansion
Right.
in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which leads to Simon Hogwood's question. You mentioned a couple of players failing the domain game. What does that mean?
I think that the most, I think I'll give you two examples of failing domain game. One of them was my good friend George, and I believe that George is listening. So, George, if you're listening, can't wait to talk to you on Father's Day. He tried to strike out into the Turgalen Forest and establish a domain. He did not negotiate with the local wood elves first. He just started building a fortress using magic and a bunch of soldiers he brought in, ended up creating a lot of strife with the local elves. And in the end, he lost a war and was driven away from his attempt at a domain as a 10th level fighter. Lost most of his followers in the siege that collapsed. Rode off with his handful of henchmen and the surviving troops, went south, and actually became a bandit lord after that. And we were joking at the time, this was going to be 1984. That's where all those 9th level, 10th level bandits come from. They're failed domain guys, right? That was probably the most interesting one. He actually ticked off the locals so bad they drove him out.
Wow.
The other one was the first attempt to make a domain at Wyvern Rock, which is now Wyvern Keep. And this is kind of infamous on my Discord, where I've talked about this a couple times. The player was really excited about getting a keep. He really wanted as much intrigue and espionage and political mumbo jumbo as possible. He was really fired up for it. So he gets in, he builds his keep, he moves in, he's on the very cutting edge of the frontier. And I've got some politics going on, this, that. And he literally wrote me a physical letter complaining that there was not enough spy intrigue, skullduggery, Byzantine Borgia-style politics. And I took him seriously. So I ramped up the level of, skullduggery and James Bond level stuff, etc. And after about 9 more months of play, he abandoned the fortress and fled. Because he felt that he could not defeat the forces arrayed against him, and was branded a coward by the king and outlawed, and fled south over the treacherous road and became another bandit lord.
Oh, wow.
So I would say those are the two most glaring examples. But there was another one. They literally were so far from civilization, they could not get enough random encounters that matched their alignment to build up a population, and they ran out of money. And that's why off in the wilderness, you're going to find this Motte and Bailey castle that's abandoned. They tried to level, and they literally, over the course of 2 game years, did not get enough random encounters that matched their alignment for them to get settlers, and they just went broke and had to go back home. So there you go.
Wow.
Like you said, there's a lot of procedures in the game on how this works. We followed them, and you're not guaranteed to make it work.
And that's one thing that I discovered to sort of support your point. I discovered when I sat down with my brother to do to kickstart a domain, because I wanted to personally test those rules out.
Sure.
And it
like
possibly
use it. Yeah, you learn so much when you do that.
You learn so much, and it really rings true with what you said about, the best way to do it is to actually play and have them get there, because we did 2 things. As we started, I said, okay, I'm gonna, we're gonna roll up a handful of henchmen, and we're gonna hand wave money away. Like, I'm not giving you a budget or anything like that. Like, we're gonna assume that we're trying to kickstart a campaign, and we're just going to see how the procedure works. So we're just gonna say you have enough money, because the rules make it really easy to roll up a level 9 fighter.
Very easy.
And it is not easy to simulate the amount of wealth that fighter might have when he's put together a war chest or a fund for a castle fund, right? There's, who's to say how many mercenary companies he's met and hired over the years, right? So there's a lot of stuff that you can't simulate. So we had to start from the assumption that this character would eventually succeed and create this keep because A, we were trying out the system, and B, I wanted to use it as a baseline for a game.
And that's perfectly reasonable, but you actually are touching on one of the reasons that it ends up being better organic or over time. There are so many variables. AD&D First Edition is underappreciated about how much Gary anticipated you'd struggle with if you played by the rules. And one of the reasons the book is so dense is it's also a manual about game design. But when it comes to domain, you read that domain stuff, and he basically is warning you, you're probably going to fail. And it's probably going to be about money over and over again if you're paying attention to how he writes it. And like you said, if you're doing it, quote unquote, artificially, you've got to hand wave the cash because it's such a complex thing in game. Yeah, it has to be done.
But really cool system nonetheless. And just spending an afternoon with a friend building a domain is genuinely fun. And
it's a wonderful mini game. Spending a couple days just doing the patrols and the wandering monster encounters and on and on and on. It's incredible stuff. Yeah. Well, what's really exciting is my wife, who is now my most consistent player of all time. This March marked her 31st year of playing in Seaward. She's about to have her third character domain inside the campaign. And we're all very anticipatory. This is going to be a lot of fun.
That's really sweet.
Yeah,
I love that. I want to let's go back to superheroes because that's
absolutely
that's where you're at right now. And I don't mean to dominate DW. Jump in if you have any other questions.
Well, before we do that, though, I did want to warn you guys. We mentioned this earlier. Father's Day is coming up, and we're scheduling 14 hours of AD&D First Edition over the 3 days of the Father's Day weekend. So there's going to be a huge play report coming out in a couple weeks.
Oh, that's fantastic. Where do we get your play reports?
I do my play reports on my blog, which is Don't Split the Party. It's harbingergames.blogspot.com. And I've got a very brief podcast I do. I'm not like you guys. I'm not a professional. My podcast average 10 minutes. And I sometimes do play reports there verbally, too.
Awesome.
Where the concept of patrons originally sprung up and got adopted into the BroSR is from Chanticleer.
From Twitter, sure. Yeah. See, I'm friends with the BroSR, but as Jeffro and I will tell you right away, I'm not BroSR. I'm not using any of their house rules, any of that other stuff. I'm just pals with almost everybody in it. Yeah. But I know Chanticleer.
And I believe he was inspired by watching the Secrets of Blackmore documentary.
Where they talk about, they talk about Dave Wesley and how Blackmore got started. Sure.
And they also talk about the Bronstein game,
which Dave Wesley created. Yeah.
Yep. So,
well, the thing is Bronstein is weird because originally the first one was you're playing like the mayor and the city guard and stuff in a town, and then your decision had impacts on the war game that happened later. And Wesley has run it. Oh my gosh, how many times has he run variants of that game? Now, he does cons, and you can still get in and play every now and then. I myself once got to play Bronstein with Luke Pulsifer, who had a copy of some of the rules. And it's an interesting game. It very, it led straight to Arneson going from, well, if I can do that, I can play a couple Hussars off on their own, to why can't I do that with a wizard, to why can't we just focus on what these low-level guys are doing? And, I think that Bronstein originally was much more, you're dealing with like peasants instead of generals. And it led to that. But yeah, faction play has been around a long time. I think that Chanticleer reading that had that. I've always wondered whoever thought that up. Did they used to play Hyborian War? The old turn-based, mail-based game where you were like in the world of Conan and you're playing like Aquilonia or New Media or one of the other nations, and you would turn in your notes every week, and you'd send off your mail orders and do turn-based faction play. I've always wondered if that inspired that. And yeah, but like I said, I've always assumed, although I've never directly asked, that the patron play came out because I know that Jeff was doing some intense play testing. And if you're doing play testing, you don't have time to wait the years and years and years to let that happen naturally. I've just always assumed that's what was going on.
So when you're looking at how the Braunstein worked, you had certain events that happened because they were player driven.
Yeah.
Like,
the source of player driven and RPGs is definitely from there.
Where they had an actual duel at one point between the leaders of the students and the leader of the soldiers who arrived in town. And it was Dave Arneson who was the leader of the students, and it was, some other player who's the leader of the soldiers. And Arneson got slaughtered like almost instantly. And they relate this in the Secrets of Blackmore film.
Oh, yeah. Love the film. Griff did a great job. Yeah.
I asked about this in the Bro SR, and everybody was like, well, yeah, if you want to learn about Braunstein, you need to go watch Secrets of Blackmore. And I was kind of miffed. I'm like, isn't there anything I can read? And somebody gave me a couple links, but I didn't really get much from the links. And so finally,
I just broke down. What? I will. This is really funny. Dave Wesley and I were talking this week, right? This very week about Braunstein, and I'm trying to get some physical copies of some of his older works off of him. But I own two because I paid for them. But I own 2 copies of Barons of Braunstein, which is the only licensed version of his rules. I'll send you one of my copies.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah. Old House Rules. Old House. I think it's Old House Rules did that. They licensed it from Wesley and printed it. Heck, I think you can get it from RPG Now. It's just a couple bucks as a PDF, but it's a licensed version of the rules. Yeah, how long have I owned that? I've owned that since it came out. I think 2014. I've had that almost 8 years. I think it was 2014 that came out. Yeah, I remember reading about it. I swear on Google Plus just before it went down.
But for anybody listening who is interested in Braunstein, which is the immediate predecessor to Blackmore, which became Dungeons and Dragons, and then the inspiration for patron play in the Bro SR, I really would recommend, as far as learning what it was like to play and what the impetus behind the design was and how the game developed, really go watch The Secrets of Blackmore. I actually ended up buying it.
Yep. I have the digital copy on DVD for the archives. Like half the guys in my Discord do that. It's a wonderful thing. And if you really want to, and this is my personal opinion, if you really want to understand the basics of game design, read the Dungeon Master's Guide for first edition. And if you want to understand where those ideas came from, read the OD&D books, read Braunstein, and watch Secrets of Blackmore. Right.
So when they were playing Braunstein, a lot of the events were player generated. The players decided to do things. In fact, most of the game was player driven. And that was the secret to making it a fun game. That was the secret to making it a compelling game.
You gotta understand, at the time it was coming from the war game situation, and there was no such thing as a game master driven anything. In the war game society, you had game A, you had side A and side B, maybe side C, and they're moving the troops around, and you might have a referee to do things like, no, that's 6 inches. No, that's 6.1. And that's all the referee could do. So coming out of that milieu, a culture that's almost been lost, the idea of anything other than player driven didn't exist, right? Even in Braunstein, the referee was just there to, okay, I've got a difference of opinion about the rules. And that's all he could do. And that it was the very basic concept baked into early D&D. It was otherwise, I don't know where this vanished. I've talked about this for years. When I started playing OD&D in 77. And then I switched to AD&D in 79. And I was a very young man when I learned how to play. And everybody who taught me came from the wargaming community. And the idea that the game master would have a plot that you had to fulfill never crossed anybody's mind, right? Because in the war games, okay, I'm gonna wheel my guys right. Well, that's not what's in the plot. There's nobody to say that, right? There's nobody to say, well, in order for the princess to be saved, you have to have the knight die at this river crossing. What do you do? So in early D&D, when I was learning and when I was first playing and what I absorbed, there was no such thing as anything but player-driven action. And it was so baked into my worldview that I was blogging on Google Plus like 2 or 3 years before I realized there were people that didn't know that was possible, let alone that was the default play.
So in terms of playing Braunstein and then connecting that with patron play, which is basically, NPC domain play. It's not player character domain play. It's NPC domain play. One of the points that I think up until now, the BroSR has missed is in Braunstein, there were player actions and then there were some GM determined actions. Right. Events that the GM happened that weren't necessarily, that were just part of the scenario that were outside of, everybody's control.
Like that were on noon of the third day, the Austrian troops will arrive. Stuff like that. Yeah.
Right. Or, in other scenarios, it may be, they were talking about Brownstone, which was a Western version of it that apparently never went off well. But you could say, okay, in Brownstone, there's going to be a wagon train that's attacked by Indians outside of town. And, that affects everybody. So one of the things I think, and I was just thinking about this a week and a half ago or so, and I mentioned it in a thread, but I hadn't gotten around to talking about this on Twitter yet, is that I think one of the reasons that the domain play right now isn't quite working, and it's even connected with your story about the spies, is that there are no DM initiated events that occur for there to be challenges in this NPC domain play, save for wandering monster checks. And
I see what you're saying. That's interesting.
I think there should be, trouble among the ranks. Or
I see what you're saying, that there's a difference between, because when you're in the domain, when you're a player character, whether you're domain or not, you're always basically getting, and there's no other way of putting this, messed with by the DM one way or another. You either get a upkeep or you're getting attacked by a rival group. And again, this is foreign to me because I've never used patrons and I doubt that I ever will. But if you've got NPC groups that are doing stuff amongst themselves and the DM's not messing with them, they're kind of rogue agents where they're almost, yeah. I don't know how it would be radically different. You'd be like, you've got one group that's directly interacting with the dungeon master, and being impeded by the DM, but also impeded by the NPC patrons. But the patrons can't be impeded by the low-level players, but the DM's not impeding them. And that's just based on what you're saying. That would be an interesting dynamic. I'd like to know more. I know that there's some pretty good play reports from the Bro SR. I'm going to, after this, I'm going to have to go look at that and see what that's like, because that sounds like a very different dynamic than Brownstein or D&D. I've been saying for a long time, I think the Bro SR has found sort of a new thing, a new game. It looks like tremendous fun, and I know they're learning a lot about games and game design from it. I'm going to have to look into that more now. Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks, Daddy. I would have never known that, because I'm very busy on my own with my own stuff, but I'll see if I can get some game reports in. Yeah.
So I think that one of the things that BroSR might want to experiment with is, in the domain or the patron level play, is having the DM take the initiative somewhat in presenting difficulties, other than just allowing other NPCs to present difficulties that they have to deal with. So other than player generated activities, there need to be DM generated activities too. And I'm not saying all the time. I'm not saying every, day of game time or every week of game time, but this is a role-playing game. DM generated problems should be happening. It happened in the original Brownstein, which were the inspiration, and it's a role-playing game. If you're going to have players running NPCs, players need to be presented with problems that they ought to overcome, and
they should be commensurate with their rank and power. Yeah, sure.
Right.
Challenges that they hear what the Bro SR has to say about that, because I'm sure they're going to have some insights. And again, I'm not familiar enough with them. Maybe some of them are doing this. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, let me give you some insights from my experience. I haven't done much in a week or two, but I was running a patron for Intralopolis, and essentially it was just a random roll in the monster manual for dwarf, and said, okay, you are playing the chieftain of this dwarf clan. And through like Daddy Warpig said, through the random encounter thing, we sort of discovered the problems that that chieftain might have, as an NPC. And of course, once again, going back to the caveat, well, this is an NPC. I don't have a player character's treasure hoard or anything like that. Like, I don't actually know what all of my resources are, but it was up to me and the ref to come up with interesting ideas and explanations for that. It does take a little bit of extra work on your part. For example, you roll up another clan of dwarves, and you make your lair check. Oh, looks like I'm not the only one in this mountain, right?
Yeah, see, that's fascinating. And we're way far afield from Atlantaverse in my campaign, and I love it. That sounds like you've got this wonderful little mini game going on, right? Where you're doing this, you're off to the side doing your own little stuff, and on the one hand, it sounds gripping and fascinating. Hey, I'm going to do some random charts. I'm going to run to people, and you're generating all this stuff. But on the other hand, I've been running D&D a long time, and I have people that have been coming back to my game for 20, 30 years. I have extensive notes and keep really detailed notes of what I'm doing. It's integral. I cannot imagine having 4 to 5 other people doing things like, well, I'm going to stock up all the monsters in this mountain and getting them that data in a way that's where I'm not feeling that I'm missing something, right? And yeah, I would be really afraid, and this may just be my own limitation, I'd be really afraid that would get away from me, and pretty soon I wouldn't know what's going on in my own world. I'd have to rely on other people to tell me what's happening. And at that point, I would feel like, and again, this may be my own limitation, I'm not the dungeon master anymore. I'm an observer. And other people are doing these things, and pretty soon, and this is, again, 40 years of experience, but I don't think that I can keep that. I don't think the campaign could survive that for more than three to 5 years before you basically had 8 mini campaigns. And I could be wrong. I could be limited in my vision. I could be so focused on the way I've been doing things for years that I can't see beyond that. But there's a rule that I've had for a long time now of when people are trying a new thing, and that's this. It's 3 rules. Are they having fun? Can other people replicate it? And are they still doing it 5 years from now? So we'll see. I'm looking forward to seeing how this plays out.
We will see. I'm excited to see where it goes because I've learned a lot. I think we've all learned a lot. We're over an hour, so I want to go right back to Atlantaverse. Let's talk about these same concepts in superhero games. How does all this work in Atlantaverse? How does all this work in a superhero game? All these concepts that work so well in the AD&D system.
They work just as fine, and I can explain that very quickly. The verisimilitude is actually key. By making sure things stay internally consistent, it allows players to dip their toe in anywhere. And that's one of the reasons why when my son Nick came to me with his cosmic level hero Apollo, who is the head of a galaxy-wide secret cabal of spies that have infiltrated every sentient species except for 3, it fit right in. Because it's easy to say, okay, this explains all your conspiracy theories can be true, and there's people that know about them or running them, et cetera, et cetera. But the strict timekeeping allows you to keep track of who's doing what. But most importantly, and we were just talking about it, is players drive the action. I don't have a plot. And I don't have an arc, right? I've got things going on, and I do a thing in all my games. Here's an example. Inside the Atlantaverse universe is WASP, which is a supervillain organization akin to Hydra from Marvel. And I had their timelines. Who's doing what inside WASP? What are their goals? What are they doing about it? How are you going to know about this? What are you going on? I have several examples of this inside the Atlantaverse book of how I do this, of this is going to happen on this day. This is why they're doing it. This is how long this is going to go on. This is what other people are going to see and reference. And by this day, X and Y will have happened, and it will end and move on to the next step. If the players notice this, because I put out stuff every week for the Atlantaverse and for Champions. I put out something every week for Atlantaverse, for Seaward, and for Blackstone, and its updates. What your players have heard this week, right? Constantly. And if they hear there's a lot of work.
Do you put out like fake front pages of the Journal-Constitution?
I actually, for Seaward, I just put out what they hear, but for the Atlantaverse, this is SNN, the Super News Network, which is basically the CNN of the universe, and I put out news bulletins, just like that. And I get these news bulletins, and at one point they completely ignored the reports of UFOs and Bigfoot in Cartersville, Georgia. Blew it off completely. For the 3 weeks that all these reports of UFOs and Bigfoot were going on in Atlanta, in Cartersville, Georgia, which is northwest of Atlanta in real life, players ignored it. Well, that was actually a crashed anti-gravity vehicle from Black Star, a group of supervillains, and one of their full chassis cyborgs was damaged, and they had to come rescue it. If they had followed it in, they would have found out it's not Bigfoot. It's actually a killer bot from the future. But since they blew it off, nothing happened. It just sort of went away, and they didn't get a chance to recover the stolen materials, on and on. So the players failed because they didn't follow it up, but there was no damage to the world as a whole. On the other hand, they did follow up on the reports of weird things going on at McCollum Airfield, the local regional airport, and ended up having a series of battles with WASP that over the course of 8 real-life years led to the destruction of WASP as an organization. And that was because the players are always allowed to decide what they're going to do. I never tell them, hey, today you're going to go here and do this. Never happens. Never happens. They decide where they're going, what they're doing, etc. And by doing that, it leads to, in my opinion, better world building. And 2, it leads to their long-term interest is being held. They're playing out their own story. They're not following mine. And more importantly, 3, it really ups the emotional investment of everybody, including me. And I think that's the real key to long-term survival of any campaign.
Okay. Well, I will drink to your continued longevity in and out of game.
And just so you know, all my notes for all my long-term, once a campaign hits 10 years, I have my notes up. My oldest son, Jack, already has all my digital notes copied. And he can't, there's a password. So if he wants to, that he has. And all my notes. And he has promised that once I'm dead, he's going to continue Seaward.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And then my son, Sam, is going to continue Blackstone. And then my son, Nick, is going to continue my Champions game. So we'll see what happens. If I leave this mortal coil before I plan to or whatever, they will continue these games for as long as they can. So we'll see what happens.
That's cool. There's a million things that I want to talk about, but we should probably wrap.
Right, I'm about to say I got to go get stuff from the smoker for dinner. I love talking to you guys. I'll tell you what, I am more than willing to come back in a couple weeks and we can continue this because there's a lot left to say.
I love it, and I hope Atlantaverse continues to be a great success. I love hearing about that.
I really appreciate that.
I'm going to repeat for everybody listening live who can't read the screen here or listening later. HeroGames.com is where you can get the book. You can also get it at your usual RPG retailers and even Barnes & Noble. By the time you're hearing this, you can probably get hardcover from Amazon.
Yeah, and I've even added to Gumroad at the request of certain people who don't like using drive-through, so it's been added to Gumroad too. Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming on. Love the chat.
You guys are great. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep. DW, any last comments or anything? And you know what? I'll just give the show to you.
Okay. All right. I want to thank everybody who joined us live to jump in the chat. It has been a vibrant and exciting chat today. We want to thank Rick Stump for coming on and joining us on the show. I think next week is going to be a week for reviews. I am really, really hoping to get out to see Maverick. I have heard very, very good things about Maverick from just about everybody, including all the people who hate it. Because they're all people whose hatred I trust. I trust their hatred to point the way to quality movies. So I'm excited. I actually have hope that this will be a good movie. And if it isn't, next week will find me a bitter and broken man. And then I hope to finish Stranger Things by next week so we can talk about it and probably some other stuff that I haven't even begun to think about watching that I'll end up having watched by the time we do next week's show. Thank everybody for listening live. We want to thank everybody who will listen later. This is Geek Gab. You can catch us just about every Saturday, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific on youtube.com/geekgab. That's youtube.com/geekgab. And you can go to that same URL and catch the show anytime because it is archived right there, or catch any one of the many, many, many previous shows. All of them are great. And you can read the chat from our amazingly awesome and intelligent audience. We are also available on the Apple iTunes Store, on SoundCloud.com, and on the Google Play Store. So you can download to the device of your choice or listen live on the web, because we're here for you in whatever medium you choose. Thanks for listening, folks. We are signing out for today, but don't you worry. Don't you fret. We will be back.